What if there was a camera that was essentially the incredibly popular A7 IV, but with better autofocus, better stabilization, and a lot of new features? This is the Sony a7C Mark II, and it's got a lot of hype around it, and for a lot of good reason, but there are a few downsides that you should be aware of. We're gonna give it a proper review, discuss all of the good things, which there's a lot of them, talk about a few of the things that are not so good, and talk about who this camera is for. It's great to have you. And this is the part where I tell you that we have a lot to get into, so get your coffee ready, but then I'd just be another camera YouTuber with a coffee. We're turning a new leaf. These things are everywhere, and this is the new one, Astro Vibe. That'd be a good name for a LUT, Astro Vibe. On to the first chapter about all the great things about the Sony a7C Mark II. The ISO and overall low light performance. The ISO range on this camera is 100 all the way up to 51,200. And we can expand that even further, making that range 50 all the way up to 204,800. It does have pretty excellent low light performance, which we'll take a look at in just 1 second, but it achieves that by an in-camera feature that's called dual baseline ISO or dual native ISO. That dual baseline ISO is a video focused feature, but that's not to say that this camera doesn't perform extremely well for low light photography. But on the video side of things, essentially what's happening with that dual baseline ISO is that every picture profile is going to have a different base ISO, and that base ISO is a very low ISO. With lower ISOs, we're going to have really smooth shadows of our image, and that's usually where when we start to increase the ISO and get into those higher ISOs, those shadows are going to have a lot of digital noise. What dual baseline ISO does is that at a certain ISO value, after the baseline ISO, we're going to increase the ISO, and then the noise will slowly be introduced, but then we're going to get a new second baseline ISO that's going to reset the noise, make the shadow areas of our image nice and smooth and clean again, and then as we increase from there, we're going to slowly start to introduce noise back into the image. Let's look at some actual practical examples of the noise performance from the a7C Mark II. These shots are going to be in S-Log3, and I'm only going to be converting them over to Rec 709 in post. No other adjustments will be made. The base ISO for S-Log3 is 800, and it's going to be really clean in the dark areas and the shadows of the image. You can take note right here of how smooth things look. And that's the area where when we increase the ISO, we're going to start to notice some digital noise. The second base ISO for S-Log3 is 3200. It's a little more noisy than 800, but it's still incredibly clean, and that same area still looks really smooth. Keep in mind that the area that we're zoomed into is 500%, which is pretty extreme and pretty rare that you'd ever zoom in that far, especially for like a low light video. But regardless, I wanted to show what the noise performance is. So when you're looking at that, make sure you're paying attention to the cropped in part, but also the non-cropped in part for what it's going to look like more practically. And then let's crank that ISO up to 20,000 to have a little bit of fun. And although these shadows aren't nearly as clean as our baseline or our second baseline ISO, which is what I'd expect, but even though it's not quite as clean, I'd say 20,000 is completely usable. The colors haven't shifted too much. They look good. I mean, the noise is there, but it isn't bad. And we're talking about 20,000 ISO there, which I rarely find myself needing to use 20,000 ISO, but it's good to know that the performance is there if I need it. And with a quick grade on that 20,000 ISO clip, we can make it look even cleaner. But that is a video for a different day. Subscribe down below. The video quality coming out of this camera is absolutely a strong point. And you're looking at it right now. I switched cameras in between a little. You didn't even notice, did you? The 4K 24 and 4K 30 is being oversampled from 7K down to 4K, and I think it looks outstanding. The colors are really rich, and there's plenty of detail, and there's space to be able to crop in and not lose any detail. How's it going? We get 3 codecs to choose from. The first one, XAVC-SI, is arguably the highest quality codec that you can use, but it's also going to be your largest file type, so keep that in mind. You also have XAVC-S, which is Sony's standard codec, that if you've used a Sony camera previously, you've probably used this codec. It's technically a lower quality than XAVC-SI, but I have an impossible time telling the difference, and I'm recording an XAVC-S right now. And there's also XAVC XAVC HS, and that's an H.265 file type, so make sure if you're going to use that your computer can handle it. One note about XAVC HS is that you're not going to be able to use a frame rate other than 24 and 60. On that 4K 60 note, camera can obviously shoot in 4K 60, and it's being downsampled, not quite from 7K, it's being downsampled from 4.6K down to 4K. And look, this downsampling thing, all that's really happening is the sensor is either capturing a 7K or for 4K 60, a 4.6K image, and it's pushing it and kind of squeezing it into 4K, which means we get a lot of detail from those higher resolutions for an output of 4K. I like the quality of 4K 60 a lot, but it does come with a 1.5 times crop, and here is what that 1.5 times crop is going to look like. But if you can get past that 1.5 times crop, I think you'll be really happy with the results of the 4K slow motion coming out of the A7C Mark II. That crop can present some challenges when it comes to framing, and I get that, but what you can do, this is the A6700 and it's a crop sensor camera. The reason I bring it up is because this is a crop sensor lens. It's the Sony 15mm 1.4. When you put this on the A7C Mark II and you put it into that 1.5 times crop, it's going to work like a charm and give you some flexibility of having a slow motion wide angle shot. Nice thing about APS-C lenses as well is that they're usually a lot more affordable than full frame lenses. This camera can record in 120 frames per second. If you want even slower motion, then 60 frames per second. But it's going to do that in full HD, so not in 4K. And when you're in 1080 at 120 frames per second, your color options are going to be limited to 8-bit. But if you put the camera into S&Q mode and go in to access your 120 frames per second via S&Q, then you're going to be able to choose 10-bit color, which is certainly more ideal. On that color note, let's talk about the colors and tones out of the A7C Mark II. This camera is getting a significant upgrade from its predecessor, that original A7C, because the original A7C, we only had access to 8-bit color. And with this new camera, we have 10-bit color. Where 10-bit color is really nice is for more flexibility in post to be able to push your colors without having them fall apart. And I think in general, 10-bit color looks a lot more natural than 8-bit. And one thing that pairs really well with 10-bit color is the picture profile of S-Log3, which is in this camera and is my preferred picture profile. It also comes with the desirable picture profile of S-Cinetone, which can be a really nice one if you don't want to deal with a lot in post in terms of color correction and grading. The S-Cinetone picture profile is going to look great coming straight out of camera. The colors and tones match so well with something like the ZV-E1, which we know shares a sensor with the FX3 or the A7S III. So if you have one of those cameras, your color matching is going to be pretty seamless. When it comes to all the color options in camera, and more importantly, the actual result that we're getting, I think Sony nailed it with the A7C Mark II. The colors and tones are extremely rich, the skin tones look great, and everything looks really natural. I'm really happy with the result that we're seeing here. And I think it's safe to say at this point that those old reputation days of Sony colors being a bit off or maybe a bit green or a bit weird, those days are over. This closed shutter setting is admittedly a very small feature, but it actually does make a pretty big difference. When this setting is toggled on, when you turn the camera off, the shutter is just going to close and remain shut until you turn the camera on again and the shutter will open again, but that can be really nice to keep dust off your sensor in between lens swaps. This A7C Mark II has a brand new in-body image stabilization design that's giving us 7 stops of usable stabilization as opposed to the 5.5 stops that were in the A7 IV. What does that mean? We're going to look at some tests in a second of how that stabilization is performing, but we're getting 2 settings when it comes to in-body image stabilization, IBIS, steady shot. These are all the same thing when it comes to Sony terminology. The first one is going to be standard, and then we also have active. That active is going to give a 1.15 times crop, which that crop looks like this. It's pretty minor, especially for what you're getting. An active is going to be your best stabilization where you're getting those full 7 stops. Here is how the stabilization looks when I have it in standard steady shot and I'm just walking in 30 frames per second, holding the camera and not really trying to smooth walk at all. And here's an example doing the exact same thing with the active steady shot enabled, which is the best that the camera can do. And you can take a look at the differences between the two right here. When it comes to autofocus, I think Sony is just showing off at this point. Look, I used the a7 IV for years and never doubted the autofocus for a second. And then this a7C Mark II comes out with the same autofocus system, but with the AI chip that enhances the autofocus for better subject recognition. It's simply best in class, and as a solo creator, I have 100% confidence using the autofocus in almost every single situation, whether that's slow motion video recording, standard video recording like right now, subject tracking, like anything. I feel really good about the autofocus keeping up and not missing. User LUTs is a feature that's been showing up on the newer Sony cameras, and it has found its way into the a7C Mark II. It's one of my favorite features of these newer Sony cameras, having the ability to install your own LUTs onto the camera via an SD card. The importing is extremely easy, but once you install it, you can actually look at what your footage is going to look like with your LUT applied before you even hit record. And although this camera isn't targeted toward the creator, vlogger, it does have a feature coming from the ZV-E1 that was targeted toward that market, auto cropping. And what auto cropping does is it's just gonna crop into the image and it's gonna track the subject. And there's different levels of how far you wanna crop in or how fast you want it to track. But what it's gonna do, it's gonna give the appearance as if somebody is filming you, which is something that you can do in post, but I've been a bit surprised that I actually like using this feature in camera to get a unique angle and save a little bit of time. The fully articulating touchscreen is kind of a good and bad situation. The bad side of it is that it shares the same screen with the Sony a7 IV, which isn't anything to brag about for the nerds out there. It's 1.04 million dots, and it's not best in class. Canon and Lumix are probably going to win here, but I think it gets the job done. I think it works fine, and I tend to keep mine in sunny weather mode, which is going to brighten it up a pretty significant amount. Arguably, that's going to drain the battery a little bit faster, but between you and me, and I haven't done the tests on this, but I keep the camera in airplane mode full time. Unless I have to like connect it to my smartphone and like use it to trigger the shutter on the camera where I'll need Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Anyways, I'll keep it in airplane mode, and arguably that, because it's turning off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, is going to save some battery. So let's just say that the sunny weather and airplane mode kind of cancel each other out when it comes to draining the battery. Something that I love about this fully articulating screen, besides the fact that it's fully articulating, which means you can look at your screen from the front of the camera, which should at this point kind of go without saying when it comes to Sony cameras that they're going to have fully articulating screens. Those a7 III days were rough. Anyways, besides it being fully articulating, what I love about it is that you can use touch to actually change the settings, which can be particularly useful when you're doing like a vlog style shot and you want to adjust your ISO, your aperture, your white balance, your shutter speed without reaching around the camera and trying to guess what button you're actually hitting. When it comes to the menu, we can say goodbye to those old confusing Sony menus. The a7C Mark II has the updated menu system, which is extremely well organized, and it also has the video-centric menu for some quick video adjustments. The camera body and dials. The A7C, the C stands for compact, which is going to make this camera really lightweight and really packable. It feels premium, it's well built, the buttons feel good, and it's weather sealed. It has this little hybrid toggle switch, which I absolutely love, and it being a hybrid camera, meaning it's good at both photo and video, and being able to switch between those two modes quickly is really useful. There are a total of 3 dials, which is great, especially if you're coming from the original original A7C, which didn't have a ton of dials, but this A7C Mark II, we get 3 dials and they're all customizable, 1 in the front and 2 in the back. So if you want to adjust for aperture, shutter speed, I even found that setting 1 to ISO can be kind of useful, but 3 total dials. It has a decent amount of customizable buttons, not quite as many as the A7 IV, but where the A7C Mark II makes up for that is, again, having that touchscreen where you can change settings, kind of opens up and provides some flexibility for how you want to customize your actual hard buttons. It does also have the 4-channel digital hot shoe on top of the camera. I absolutely love this, especially when you pair it with something like the Sony ECM M1 microphone, which is ridiculously compact and really high quality. You're able to get 4-channel wireless audio. And because you guys are always asking what my current gear is, I'll link my ECM M1 microphone along with my current kit down below if you want to check that out and be all nosy, you creep. Battery life and overheating, a hot topic to say the least. When it comes to battery life, you can expect 2 hours of continuous video recording and about 540 photos per battery charge. Overheating is not nearly as simple as that. I did a total of 4 tests. The conditions for the test were really simple. I didn't have all the doors of the camera open because I wanted to make it a little more practical. I don't think that you should have to use a camera and open up the battery door and the SD door and the screen and throw a fan on it. I just had the screen open, but that's pretty practical. Had the camera on a tripod. I was in 422, 10-bit color, and this is what I got. Oh, and I was in 74 degrees Fahrenheit and about 23 degrees Celsius. Okay, so for the 4K 24 or 4K 30 continuous recording, I gave the camera an external power supply because I wanted to see how long it could actually go. And it went for over 3 hours. The overheating warning never came up. It never shut down. Nothing. That's pretty good. I have complete confidence in terms of continuous 4K 24 or 4K 30 recording. This camera can go for as long as I want it to. You might notice that my recording time code is a lot different than the actual timer that I was recording. That's because I had to format my SD card a few times, which takes a total of 5 seconds. So for all intents and purposes, it was a continuous shot. For my 4K 60 continuous shot test, I ran that to 90 minutes and then my SD card, I think, ran out of space and I just shut the test down. The heat warning never came on and I think I could have recorded for as long as I wanted to in 4K 60 in the conditions that I was testing in. And I think that's because usually cameras are going to have a harder time with 4K 60 where they're going to overheat a lot faster than the previous test of 4K 24 or 4K 30. But because this camera is downsampling a 7K image down to 4K for standard 4K 30 and 4K 24, that's going to be working a lot harder than the 4K 60, which is only downsampling from 4.6K. In short, you should be just fine if you need to do continuous long 4K 60 recording. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but in camera for all these tests, I also had the high heat setting in the camera turned on. This next test is the only one where I got the camera to turn off due to overheating, and that was when I had it set up as a webcam for live streaming in 4K 30 while simultaneously recording that same shot onto an SD card. And I probably could have guessed that this is going to be the most demanding on the camera. We got an hour and 9 minutes and the camera shut down due to being too warm. And the last test was just using it as a webcam without simultaneous recording. So as a webcam at 4K 30. Never got it to shut down. It did have the heat warning come up around minute 55, but it never actually shut down. My ZV-E1 did shut down at like an hour 44, which is where I stopped the test, but I don't have any concerns about this camera as a long format live streaming camera considering how well it did in the 4K 24 and 4K 30. But the results on that, I got an hour 44, not because the A7C Mark II shut down, because the camera that I was using to record the back of the screen did shut down. Look, Gerald Undone did a good video recently talking about how overheating tests are pretty inconsistent, and I can certainly agree with that based on my experience, so take all of that with a grain of salt. I've used a lot of Sony cameras and put a lot of them through overheating tests and can say that the A7C Mark II, surprisingly, especially because it's such a compact design with such high settings and high video output, I don't have any concerns about this camera overheating. As a live streaming or webcam, I think the A7C Mark II is really good. Not only do we get get that 4K 30, which is pretty awesome. We get 4K 30, but also we already talked about how good the colors are coming out of this camera, especially in something like a Cinetone picture profile. I think that plus the lack of overheating, all that combined make this a really strong contender for a good live streaming or webcam. And it is kind of cool that it can record to an SD card simultaneously while being a webcam. Just keep in mind the overheating results that we just looked at. To access that 4K 30, you need the proper USB-C cable. I'll link the one that I use down below. The focus breathing compensation setting. Look, if you watch enough videos on YouTube, you might notice that people have their videos and like the edges of the frame are pulsing. That's usually a combination of the autofocus speeds in the camera plus the lens that they're using. There's a lot of factors. With the A7C Mark II, you can actually mitigate that and make for it's not a huge deal, the pulsing, but you can make for a much more like seamless viewing experience with a setting like focus breathing compensation. It's going to crop in by 1.15. Here's what that 1.15 crop is going to look like when this setting is turned on. But when that's turned on, the camera's going to work in conjunction with the lens to make sure that when the focal plane changes, that there's no breathing or pulsing happening on the edges of the frame. It does only work with Sony native lenses though, so keep that in mind. This shot that you're looking at right now, my main angle for my YouTube studio, I know it looks really simple, but what I've learned is that to make a simple shot look really good is a lot of things have to go right. I've learned so much over years of being obsessed with this exact angle that I've put into a guide, whether it's in camera settings, lighting, audio, and all the things in there. I think you can only kind of get that information if you just have years of, again, just being obsessed with making a video shot like this look great. That's all been packaged into my Make Your Videos Look Great guide, and it's also kind of a checklist. So if you're trying to master a similar shot to this, or really any shot, because a lot of the lessons in there are going to be transferable to anything that you're doing, but specifically if you're trying to master a shot like this, and you want to see how my mind works with the checklist that I go through to make this shot look good, you can check that guide out. I'll link it down below. Because y'all are here, and I love you, and I really want you to check it out, I'm going to do 25% off with the code YouTube. Simple enough, right? And this A7C Mark II being a hybrid camera, let's talk about some of the photo benefits that we're getting. The first one is the resolution of the sensor. The sensor on the A7C Mark II is going to give us 33 megapixel photos, which I really think is the sweet spot. The file sizes aren't massive, the image quality is outstanding, and there's plenty of information similar to the 4K video, but there's plenty of information there to be able to crop in and not lose a ton of detail. They're tack sharp, and the colors and tones similar to the video side of things that we're getting is really nice. And a very interesting topic with this camera is the photo compressions. The first compression that we're going to get in RAW is uncompressed. These are going to be your biggest file types and arguably the highest quality. There's also going to be lossless compressed. And in lossless compressed, Sony claims that there's no deterioration of the photos in contrast to the uncompressed, but the file sizes are going to be a lot smaller, which is great. And the last RAW setting is the compression, and those are going to be about half the file size as the uncompressed, but with compressed you might get a little bit of quality loss. And we can also shoot in JPEG, but we don't get a camera like this to shoot in JPEG. Now, why I say the compressions are kind of interesting is with the next topic of the burst rate or the frames per second for the photography. And what you're getting is a burst rate of 10 frames per second, whether that's with the electronic shutter or the mechanical shutter. There is a potential issue here and also a really interesting fix by Sony. The issue is that if you're in uncompressed RAW, you're going to get 10 frames per second up to about 27 photos, and then the buffer is going to fill up and your frames per second is going to go down significantly. And that'll happen until you let off the trigger, let the buffer catch up the right speed to the SD card, and then you can fire away again. But that's not a true 10 frames per second because 27 photos isn't really a ton. But if you put it in the lossless compressed setting, then you're going to be able to get 10 frames per second until your SD card fills up. And as I mentioned earlier, Sony claims that lossless compressed has no deterioration over uncompressed, and we get the benefit of not filling up the buffer, so kind of a win-win there. But no camera's perfect, and the a7C Mark II certainly has a few downsides. Most of these downsides are going to come back to the camera body, which has its benefits of being a compact camera, but we get some trade-offs. For one, the grip is kind of weak. It's an upgrade from the original a7C, but it's not great. I mean, my a6700, which is also a compact camera, has a substantially better grip than the a7C Mark II. I don't know why they didn't include that grip on this camera. One thing that helps the grip a little bit, doesn't help with the depth issue, but it helps out with the length of it and your pinky falling off, is this small rig grip extension. It's a lot better than the Sony one, which they started offering with this a7C. That's ridiculously overpriced and kind of just a weird grip in the first place. This small rig one is great, and it's only 40 bucks. Theme of the video, I'll put a link for that down below too. This camera's only giving us a micro HDMI port, which if you use an external monitor, you already know. We don't love micro HDMI. They do the job, but they do break. There's no joystick on the a7C Mark II, something that the a7 IV did have, and I love the joystick on there. It makes it really easy to switch autofocus points. I mean, sure, on the a7C Mark II, you can use the touch to change your autofocus points on the screen, but the downside to that is that you can't be in that mode plus touch to track at the exact same time, and that's a little bit annoying. It only has one SD card slot. Two can be nice for a little bit of insurance and shooting some redundancy. But what I found with one SD card slot, if you buy high quality SD cards, the technology has come so far that I think you're going to be okay and not have an SD card fail. But if you're a pro charging good money, then you already know that you should probably have two SD card slots, and you're probably not looking at this camera as your main camera anyways. I use the Sony Tough cards, and over 4 years, I haven't had one of them fail. Knock on, it's not wood. The electronic viewfinder is weird. I don't love it. I've never loved the placement of the EVFs on the side of these Sony compact cameras. It's an upgrade from the original a7C, but it's kind of dim. The eye cup is strange, but it does have an EVF and it does work. The mechanical shutter for photography only goes to 1/4000. I don't know why this is. On the a7 IV, it goes to 1/8000. I mean, on the a7C Mark II, you can get 1/8000, but you have to be in the electronic shutter. I don't love using electronic shutters for photography. You run the risk of getting some banding in your images. I just don't know why it doesn't go to 1/8000 for the mechanical. Having 1/8000 as opposed to 4000 can be helpful, especially in those really bright situations and you want some flexibility over your exposure. And because the a7C Mark II shares the same sensor from the Sony a7 IV, we are inheriting the poor rolling shutter performance. What rolling shutter is if you're filming or taking photos of a fast-moving subject, or you're whipping the camera around for some reason, and you want your vertical lines to be straight, they're not gonna be because the camera doesn't have great rolling shutter performance. So it shares those wobbles from the a7 IV, and if you look at it in comparison to something like the ZV-E1, which has pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good rolling shutter performance, you can see the differences between these two cameras. People tend to think this is a deal breaker, and in some applications it very well could be, but for most of us, you're never gonna notice it, but it is a downside that's worth noting. The 4K 60 1.5 times crop is certainly a downside, especially because other cameras from other brands at a similar price point targeted at a very similar market have cropless 4K 60. They also might have worse autofocus, but the Sony a7C Mark II does have that 1.5 times crop nonetheless, which can make for some challenges depending upon your lens lineup. But from a practical use perspective, I do think that similar to rolling shutter, I don't see this as much of a deal breaker as you might think, because typically for 4K 60, we're doing that for slow motion shots, which are usually handheld or on a gimbal, and we're able to move around and adjust our frame and get the shot that we need. So it's an issue on paper, but I think it's a lot less of an issue in practical application. Does that make sense, or am I all hopped up on Astro Vibe? Answering who this camera is for is a little bit complicated, but I have some thoughts that might help you out. I think it's easiest to answer who it's for if we first talk about who it's not for. Although it's capable of some pro level features, if you're a pro covering a once-in-a-lifetime event, a live event, a wedding, you're not getting this camera. At least as your main camera, you're not. Because simply it doesn't have 2 SD card slots. And you know the value and the importance, if you're charging good money, to have 2 SD card slots for some insurance in case one of them fails. And if you're somebody who's taking photos of or filming ridiculously fast-moving subjects, or you're whipping your camera around and you want perfectly vertical lines, you're not getting this camera due to the poor rolling shutter performance. Or if you're somebody who needs more than 10 frames per second burst for photos for like action sports or fast-moving nature, you're probably not getting this camera. You want some higher frame rates for photos. But for most of us, 10 frames per second is going to be plenty. You're probably also not getting this camera if you absolutely, and think about this, but you absolutely need cropless 4K 60. You're not getting this camera. For everybody else though, this is a fantastic camera at $2,200 and I have no problem recommending it. And I would say at that $2,200 price point, with how much value is packed into it, it's probably, all things considered, it's probably the best hybrid camera on the market at that price point. I think it's an excellent camera for somebody's first camera or their first full frame camera, and it has so many settings and features that even when the new cameras start coming out, what's in this camera is going to hold up over time. I got it because it pairs so well with my ZV-E1, which the ZV-E1 can do things from a video perspective that the A7C Mark II simply can't, but the A7C Mark II can do things from a photo perspective that the ZV-E1 can't. They go together like Forrest and Jenny. Did you see it? Forrest Gump? He's just a guy from Greensboro, Alabama. So if you want a camera that's really compact with ridiculously high quality photo and video with crazy good autofocus systems, the A7C Mark II might be your camera. I think it's actually really good and intuitive for a beginner who wants to grow into some pro level features, and also the pro who wants to pick it up and jump right in. I did swap out my A7 IV to pick up this A7C Mark II, and if you're thinking about doing the same, you'll need to know how to use it. And I'll be doing a lot of videos on the channel, cinematic video settings, how to customize the camera, how to get the best photos possible, the works. And if you don't want to miss those, you can tap that little circle of me right there to subscribe to the channel. And here's a video that the YouTube algorithm thinks is going to be perfect for you from my channel. Anyways, I'll see you in the next video. Take care. See ya.